common sense. That's Professor Carl Hennigan, Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I want to talk to you about COVID and measles, but I want to very briefly also just ask you about how on earth do you think the human race is going to survive a heat storm, as apparently we're getting in Europe? We haven't. I mean, I'd love to have a sodding heat storm here in Britain. It's been rainy and miserable and windy all weekend. What do you make of the advice, as someone who works in A&E at weekends? You're not just an academic. You do useful work as well, she said. I'm waiting for you to be cross about that. But in terms of the advice that people have got about how to deal with 40-degree plus temperatures.
Well, I'm pretty sure you're going to survive it, Julia, because I keep seeing pictures of you on Twitter out there in the Riviera.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But I think what we're talking about here is the ability for common sense and pragmatism. Now, there are a group of people who do suffer considerably with the heat, and it tends to be the very elderly. And so there it makes sense to have precautions and fans and make sure those people are cool and hydrated. But the rest of us, we're talking about common sense measures here. But what you're seeing is this over-dramatisation. By next week, we'll move on to the next issue. So I think we're just talking about here being common sense. But at the moment, in this country, we have no problem with the heat right now, do we?
We really do not. We have a problem with the lack of heat right now for a lot of people heading off their summer holidays next week as well. Let's talk about COVID. I think the final week of the phase one of the COVID inquiry. This is looking into preparations, the pre-pandemic planning. We've got one more week of that. What have we learned so far?
I'm not sure whether we've learnt much. I think it's been, module one has been about preparedness, so we've not looked at any interventions, whether they work or not. So it's looking at the way into the pandemic. What we've seen is that I think the government's shown to have a complicated system that's been confused. We've had an awful lot of excuses. Your favourite one is Brexit was the one reason we weren't prepared. But there's been lots of really interesting ones. Arlene Foster said it was the acronyms. Up in Scotland, they said they had a poor line. And then we've had Boris Johnson, who still can't supply his messages, not just because he can't switch his phone on, but now he can't even remember the code for his phone. So I think, where are we? We have a problem with this inquiry. I don't think what they're doing is getting to a position where they can actually say, let's look at the evidence of what worked and think about whether we instituted that. What they seem to be doing is just saying, we're prepared. And prepared for what, in effect?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, you mentioned the WhatsApps, big fuss. I mean, everyone was talking about Hugh Edwards and complaining, or certainly on social media, people weren't talking about the Prime Minister's phone not being handed over. I mean, there are definitely ways of getting an unlocked phone. I mean, you can just go to Kilburn High Street and get that sorted. I find it quite bizarre that the former Prime Minister can't do it. I mean, I don't know what we've got security services for if they can't deal with things like that.
So this is a really serious issue, I think, that needs to be fought through. Remember, in America, you're not allowed to use your own phone. Hillary Clinton got in a load of trouble by using her own emails because they want a public record of every transaction and every communication that's gone on. Whereas here, what we're talking about, Boris has used his own phone, and that phone is, in effect, he said, I'd hand over the messages. But now what we're seeing is a sort of level of obfuscation because they didn't even back up the messages. So if that's the level of governance, we have a serious issue about how we go about how we look after our citizens. It is unacceptable to have communications about policy on private phones that are not recorded.
And we saw that absolutely during the lockdown diaries that Isabel Oakeshott, our colleague who at talkTV exposed, where WhatsApp messages between Matt Hancock and people, they were making policy on the hoof very casually. And it's important we know that, because that's basically what you and I and many others were saying the whole way through. It wasn't based on science, and we need to know that, and we need to have the proof of that. If people want to use the same method of communication with a sort of, oh, can you pick up milk on the way home? Oh yeah, shall we make millions of children wear masks for the next year in school? If you want to do that in the same format, that's your choice, but we still have a right to see those messages.
Correct, and that's why we have records in Parliament like Hansard. So here's a lack of democracy because he put in the power in a few people's hand and there's no record. This is serious issues. I think they are going to look at this inquiry and say there are ways you are governing that is not fit for purpose, just not in pandemics, in normal times, that we have to fix. And there needs to be a record of what every minister said. Now, if Boris can't remember his code, that has serious issues. I've never met anybody who doesn't know their phone code, because all the time when we're using authenticators, using banks, we'd be in deep trouble, because we just wouldn't be able to be...
Maybe that's why he needs all these loans, because he can't get access to any of his bank accounts. Who knows?